Hello, everyone, and welcome to my show that's hosted by Unique Voices and Films in collaboration with the Path of Consciousness and CMN TV. I'm your host, Hui Amnemu, and my special guest today is Roy Gessford. Hello, Roy.
Good morning, Liam. Shalom Loch and Shalom Lechon to all your viewers. That means peace be unto you.
Thank you, Roy. And we'll get into all of that on how an American-born man knows how to speak Aramaic. So Roy is a publisher, educator, and scholar with a deep commitment to preserving heritage and sharing wisdom. He graduated from the University of California, San Diego, with a degree in urban studies and planning, and later earned a multi-subject teaching credential specializing in English language learners. In 2020, Roy completed his master's in Interfaith Action from Claremont Lincoln University, focusing on preserving the Aramaic language. His thesis, Preserving the Chaldean Aramaic Language, was later published. Roy founded Let in the Light Publishing in 2012 to share meaningful stories and has since published 14 books, including works by renowned Aramaic scholar Father Michael Bazzi. He has taught and lectured on Aramaic worldwide, including at the Chaldean Cultural Center in Michigan and Doshisha University in Japan. A former professional tennis player and coach, Roy is also the author of A High School Tennis Coach's Handbook. His writings have appeared in publications such as Inside Tennis, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Christian Science Sentinel. Roy is a lifelong member of the Mother Church and has served in various church roles, including as an advisor to Christian Science organizations at San Diego universities. Wow, Roy, I only read part of your bio, by the way. It's a lot longer than that, but I figured some of the other information we can discuss them on this interview.
Definitely. Looking forward to it.
So, Roy, when we met, one of our biggest topics was Father Michael Bazzi. And that's because you worked closely with him, and that was part of your introduction to even Aramaic, the language. So if you can tell us, you had just finished language courses at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and then you were introduced to his teachings. How did his teaching style and content differ from what you learned from Western scholars?
Well, thank you for acknowledging, that Father Michael is a great teacher. I had been blessed to, first of all, be accepted at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. I was not a great scholar as an undergrad, and my GPA, I think, was a 2.76, which, as you know, that means studying was probably not my number one priority. But to get into the program, you needed a 2.75. So I had done just enough. And they were very rigorous courses taught by Americans with great degrees, but they were outsiders to the culture. And so as grateful as I was for those teachings, I still felt like I wanted to go a little bit deeper. And Aramaic presented that possibility. And on the last day of Hebrew class at the seminary, which I think was being taught at like a UCC seminary, there's 12 seminaries. It's a conglomerate. It's the largest seminary west of the Mississippi, and they've got a great library. And I think one was at a Lutheran university, my Greek. And so here I had been sent a YouTube video of a gentleman, his name was Dr. Errico, reciting the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic. I thought to myself, how interesting. But I knew that if Dr. Errico had learned the language, it was possible for others. So I scrolled down to the video and I got his information and I called him. And I said, hi, Dr. Errico, I watched your video and thank you so much for putting this together. How do I learn Aramaic? I just finished Hebrew and Greek at a seminary and I can go on and get a degree at this seminary, but to learn Aramaic, this is a wonderful opportunity. And he says, well, there's only one place in the world really where you can go right now, Roy, and that's San Diego, to learn from a professor named Father Michael Bazzi. And I thought, well, this is interesting because in books like the New Interpreter's Bible, which is a very well-respected commentary, it says that Jesus spoke Aramaic but that none of the surviving people or its text were in existence. And this was a chance I was willing to take. Textbooks are right, textbooks are wrong, times change, you have to adapt. And it was interesting to me that here is somebody else recommending somebody else. This man had not promoted himself. Father Bazzi was recommended by somebody else. And that's always a sign that, they're that good. So I go down, I interview with Father Michael. It was an interesting time. And he says, Roy, the only class I have coming up is a modern intermediate Aramaic class, Aramaic 2. And I really wanted to learn the ancient Aramaic, but I saw this as my stepping stone into the class. And so as I had learned a little about Father Michael, and my previous professors at seminary were from Western seminaries, I knew that Father Michael had grown up in a small village outside of Mosul called Tilkepe, and he had done some pastoral work there. And then he had gone on to Rome, and then he had gone to the United States, and he'd been there for about 25 years, at least, at the university. And so I was expecting a blend of teaching, a Western. Rome is kind of right in between, and then Eastern, from Iraq and Mesopotamia. And I'll never forget the first day of class, because as well as Father Michael had learned to blend his teaching style, he definitely came out in the Roman position on the opening day. I mean, he just laid down the law, and it was like, whoa, we're going to get into corporal punishment here. I hope I don't make a mistake. And I wasn't quite ready for that, because I had never really been around that. And I wasn't uncomfortable.
You've never been to Iraq?
But he saved me airfare. The Chaldean people, I'm going to wave this flag every time they save me money or they prop me something. I had, and this is the flag of the Chaldeans. I'll just show you. You'll see it waving a lot. Because I would go anywhere to learn something. It's geography is not a big deal, but Iraq airfare was expensive, and of course this was during ISIS, and I really didn't want to go there at that time. And here was this man who had come to our country, and he opens with just, "This is the law, and it's my classroom." And I went right to the proctor's office and I said, "Excuse me, can I take this class pass, no pass?" Because I'd been around academia, and grades count. Grades are a big deal. I had done very well at the seminary in Hebrew and Aramaic, Hebrew and Greek, and I thought, forget it was this one. I don't have a chance, because all the other people in the classroom were native Aramaic speakers who couldn't read and write their own language. So yeah, your question, had I been to Iraq, the answer is no, but thanks heavens, the Chaldean people had come here, and they brought a plethora, just a myriad of experiences. And eventually, like maybe after 2 weeks, his Western style was good, but the Eastern style is what won my heart. And that was, he would say, "Dear class, I'm from this village, and under my pillow where I sleep every night is a small pouch that has soil from my hometown village." I think to myself, whoa, how dear. And then he would start talking about, the people in the class and their commonalities and how Eastern culture was. And he would say, "Does everyone in the class remember growing up in the fields?" I didn't realize it was that small a village. And we would grow, and there would be something called gleaning. We have like Social Security in the United States where you get cash, but in those environments, you left extra things from the field on the ground or in certain areas for the outcasts of society to come pick them up and eat. Well, this was an ancient Ruth. The book of Ruth is about a gleaner, and that that they were still practicing those social welfare practices in Iraq up until the day that everyone in the classroom raised their hand and said, "Yes, we remember the gleaning." And I thought, this is definitely not classic Western environment. And I was just so grateful to be there and to be learning from what I would consider a master teacher.
And then what happened afterwards? How did you end up publishing his work?
That was an interesting one. Yeah, it was. I was in his class for a full semester, and I did get through that first modern intermediate Aramaic class. And so he kind of saw that I had the skills to learn the language. But he wanted to feel me out a little bit. In the second semester, we started having some conversations about my theology, and And I couldn't quite figure out why he was asking me these things. And I was showing common ground with him. But he was testing me in a number of ways. And so finally I went and researched him at the UC San Diego Library, where I had done my undergrad. And there was some books on Chaldeans, and he was mentioned in some of them. And I said, Father Michael, I have found some books that mention you. Are you aware that you're mentioned in these books, in your works? And he said, no, I had no idea. Would you bring them to me? I said, sure. And so I went and I purchased the books online, and the bill was $88. And I had just written a book on tennis, and it was $12. It was $14.99. I said, Father Michael, I'll give you a deal. For $100, I'll throw in my tennis book too. And we're in America, we're wheeling and dealing, and he's been through that, and he says, sure, Roy. And he reads my tennis book, and he says, Roy, I used to coach volleyball. Father Michael, here's this 80-year-old professor. Yeah, we were quite good in Detroit and Michigan. And I thought, wow. And he said, and we have very similar styles of coaching. And I think you would make a good publisher. Would you like to publish my books? So midway through the second semester, and now we're in classical Aramaic, which is the language of the prophets, and something I'm a little more passionate about because I can only speak really modern Aramaic in the classroom. And I say, sure. And as soon as I make this agreement, I look into it, I realize there's no keyboard for this. He had done all his books by hand. Matter of fact, when I first met him, it was at his office at St. Peter's in El Cajon, and he handed me a book. And he said, Roy, this is for you. And I had just finished my tennis book, which was in English and was very difficult for me to do. And I thought, no, I'll pay the man. I said, Father Michael, how much would you like for your book? And he said, $20. I thought, $20 for a hand-done Aramaic? I said, no, Father Michael, I'm going to give you $40 for this book.
You understood the value of his work.
That was the big thing. I had been in collectibles before. And so he had felt from the beginning, that I appreciated his work. And then I called Tim Cook at Apple and even was in contact. I said, you guys, is there any way you have a keyboard for this? And they said, no, we don't. And I went to Father Michael. I said, I'm happy to do your books, but is there anybody? He said, well, Monsieur Keshbo. And Monsieur Keshbo is in his 80s at St. Michael's in the same area, another church. He might know something. So I go in and interview with Monsieur Keshbo. And he says, Roy, we had Apple computers in Iraq. And I figured out a font, and I would be happy to share it with you. So here this had already existed. And so now I had the works and the font, but I really didn't know what I was going to do for covers. And one of the classmates, and this was an interesting thing with the classmates, but her sister had just come back from Baghdad. And she had so happy to be in America with her new country that she went and she was staying in Saddam Hussein's palace as somebody teaching 4-H, which is kind of, a commonality essentially. And in her off time, she would go and take pictures in Babylon. She had this world-class set of pictures, and she came to me and she said, Roy, I'm very tired. I want to be with my family. I have all these pictures, and I don't know what to do with them. And I thought, I have the covers, I have the work, and I have the language now. And so we've been working on the books ever since.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I just got to say, Father Bazzi says that you're the best Chaldean there.
Well, I had to learn what a Chaldean was because you told me what that was a long time ago. Again, these books say these people don't exist. And so, I'm thinking to myself, Iraq, these hidden villages, and now they're in our country. And sure, we're the freest country in the world, but didn't we invade them? It was kind of, I think the first day, one of the reasons he came down so hard, maybe he wanted to make sure, first of all, he had to start teaching in a third language because everyone else spoke Arabic and Aramaic, and now he had to shift to English, which was good for everybody, but he wanted to see maybe I was a spy or, who knew?
Well, I mean, also he comes from an old school where, the Karate Kid, when he was teaching him karate, that's the old school. They didn't. So that was like the Iraqi style of teaching. That's why I was joking if you hadn't been to Iraq, because this is how they operate. But, I think his message to us, I know, not just for me, for others, that he told them, take good care of this guy. He's a true Chaldean. And the reason he said that is as he and the community has watched. You have been traveling. I know that your passion is Aramaic, but you have been in your travels. You're like one of the apostles that has gone to different areas and, introducing people to the Chaldeans who have never heard of us. You don't use social media to do that. You use very personal interactions. And I think oftentimes that sticks even more. But he and we see that effort. And I want to ask you, why do you think preserving the Chaldean legacy is so important? To the point where somebody like yourself, who was born in San Diego, has felt that necessity to do so. As a Westerner, I'd like your perspective on this.
Sure. Well, let's see. This is the reason that I was drawn to the Chaldeans in the first place was biblical. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar, he's he's a pretty tough dude. When the Chaldeans ruled the world, it was with an iron fist and in order to keep things in order. And that's how Aramaic ended up in the Holy Land. It was because of three successive kingdoms. And I should speak to the word Chaldean because as I've done the history, it's actually a pretty encompassing term. And what I mean by that, if you go back to the early societies, there's no doubt there was Sumer and Akkad, and we're talking about, 6,000 BC. And then there was Chaldees and Babylon, and it's really an ethnic term. And it encompasses every Mesopotamian at some level because they all had the same origin. So those that are Assyrian or Mandaean, the Bible calls them Sabians, or even Yazidi, it is the way I look at Chaldean is an umbrella term. And I know that some are more specific and die hard about that term. But when I first wrote my academic paper, I just called it preserving Aramaic. And I was thinking, of the Syriacs and, the Jewish Aramaic and all these things, Galilean, the much later Western dialects. And my professor said, in the first place, not many Westerners know what Aramaic is. And in the second place, you need to be more specific. So I ended up calling it preserving the Chaldean Aramaic. But as I got to know Mandaeans and Yazidis, I just realized there was a commonality that included language, but went far beyond that. And anytime you learn a language, you really need to learn the culture it came out of. And for me to learn the history of the native Iraqis and as an urban studies and planning major, I had studied what I thought were the major cities in the world, New York and maybe Rome or some of these things. But Babylon and some of the earlier cities, they were the land of first. They created, each civilization kind of builds on the advances of the previous ones, and much was owed to the Chaldeans. And I realized they're pretty humble people. And in the West, not only is their language not known, but their history isn't known. And this specifically tied into the Bible, because when you go to seminary in the West, many times the professors will say, oh, it's a mystery. We don't know. Oh, that's beyond us. And I never heard that from Father Michael. Anytime we got to a verse that was controversial or difficult, he said, oh, well, that's easy. And the original language is this, that, and the other. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, actually, it does make perfect sense, too. And it didn't really change things. It just added flavor. I sometimes use the example of a hot dog. If the Bible is something like that, it doesn't change the hot dog. But a plain hot dog without mustard or ketchup or onions or relish or avocado or sprouts or whatever you want to put on your veggie dog or your burger or whatever, it makes it taste so much better. But you don't know that until you've tried it with the extra additives on.
I think I might have that for lunch. It sounds so good the way you just described all that.
We had a big barbecue here last night watching the Blue Jays.
Where are you at right now, by the way? I know you're traveling somewhere every day.
This is Southern Oregon. I have a picture of, this was a working ranch. And it's a beautiful place. I've got a lake and a golf course. And preparing for the conference, the Beth Narain conference on November 8th, I thought, I'd better take a couple of weeks in a real quiet rural spot and just focus on things. So yeah, getting the message out to humanity about the gift the Chaldean people have given us has been a unique challenge, and one that I felt originally I didn't really want to do it. I was like Jonah, but I thought, if this is what I'm called to do, if you'll show me the way here, divine love, I'll follow.
And like you said, you mentioned Beth Nahrain, which is November 8th, Saturday, from 10 a.m. till about 1:32 p.m. that we're having this online. And it's exciting. It's the fourth annual one. I can't believe it. I mean, I don't know. Time has passed. I do have to thank you for being the one that followed. You approached me about this at the Chaldean Cultural Center, and you said we need to have a conference. Part of the reason that this discussion happened, we were mentioning how Chaldeans feel unheard. Chaldean scholars, writers, individuals who have studied this history in depth, but have not had the opportunity to really be at the table. People are speaking on our behalf, and they've done the research, they've done the hard work, but they've also had a very hard life where they're like in survival mode, trying to come to the US or what have you. And we said, well, let's do a conference that the people of their own community can tell their stories, not have others tell it for us. And that once that started, we have continued. We had it at Oakland University last year, but this year, because we have some guests that are outside of Michigan, which I think it's wonderful with the technology that we can have, we can broaden the scope of the speakers. But this leads us to why we formed it and the importance of it. So you're a big encourager of us telling our own stories. Please share a little bit about that. How the Chaldeans can, because right now, you're the one, we want to be also Father Bazzi's favorites, not just you, okay? So we want to win him over. And how can we do that? How can we learn more about our heritage and be the voice so that this precious name that you are saying, it's ancient. Our ancestors did not want us to forget it, let alone, so the fact that even Westerners are now acknowledging that, let alone for us to forget it.
Well, the Chaldeans do have a story, and they're not afraid to tell it, but it's finding the right audience that respects them. And I remember I was in this class, and I think it was my first or second semester, and I'm with these Chaldeans, and unfortunately, many of Father Michael's, they would be his great grand nephews and nieces, and they were at like USD or San Diego State, and they had taken time to come to the community college, Cuyamaca, where Father Michael was teaching, and learn from this renowned teacher. But they were a bridge because they could speak English quite well. And I got to, the ice was eventually broken between myself and my classmates, who were fairly somber. This, again, is in the middle of the ISIS invasion. And I can only imagine what their relatives were going through and some of their stories to get here. And so I'm sitting outside, I'm walking around the campus at a break, and there's 4 Chaldean men there. And they're in nice, button-down shirts, and they look very respectful. And of course, they've been on the planet much longer than I have, but they really don't have any English skills. And I'm walking by them, and for the first time, they call my name, and they say, Roy. I say, yes, hi. They say, Roy, do you know Nahum? And he said it with such conviction that who hasn't heard of this person? I'm thinking to myself, huh? I grew up in Los Angeles. I used to play volleyball next to like Wilt Chamberlain. He was pretty good. And I saw Wayne Gretzky, he hit some, and he was the great one. And I said, excuse me. And I said, Nahum, he's from Alcoa, Nahum. Thinking to myself, well, he's a politician. I met the Reagans, Nancy Reagan, nicest lady in the world. And I'm trying to put it in context. Roy, Nahum, Alcoa. I think, Nahum. There's one H-A-H pronunciation. They're calling the prophet in the Bible Nahum, and I'm used to Nahum. And I said, you mean Nahum? They said, yes, we're from Nahum, the village of Alcoa. What are you, some sort of American dummy? And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's me. But I did go home that night, and I looked at it, and it says, in the Bible, if this is the Bible, the Holy Bible we're all familiar with, Nahum the Alcoshite. And I'm thinking to myself, oh boy, like there is a historical perspective that I had better, change pretty quickly here, because the stories I tell, they come from a country that's barely 200 and, going on 250 years. Thank God, these next couple of years, I think it's this year or next year, but these people are 7,000 years of history. And so when I got into the perspective, first of all, I was honored that they shared with me, what some of their stories were. But at the same time, it humbled me because I realized how much I had to learn.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I'm even learning about, coming to the West. I often tell people how we were not really learning about this in Iraq and had to come thousands of miles to the other side in order for us to learn about our own heritage. And once you discover, people sometimes tell me why I'm passionate about this, or, the details. Well, what happens is when you look into this history, just like when you realize, oh, there's people that still speak Aramaic, well, let me look into that. And what happens is the deeper that you look into it, the more fascinated you are, the more you start feeling like there's a responsibility to preserve, whether it's the language, whether it's the heritage, and the people who wrote their memoirs, including like Maria Teresa Esmar, a Chaldean woman, Reverend Ilyas Naim, I'm sorry, Ilyas al-Musali, and Reverend Joseph Naim, all
And you are an
Chaldean.
expert on these, just so the public knows. I've read your accounts on these three people, and they're absolutely better than Hollywood, anything Hollywood's put out in the last 50 years. I mean, those are movies ready to be made.
Because
So
it came from the heart. Oh my God, I did so much research. I had to, in order to write them in a language that, in a way that people can easily understand, and also for schools, for youth. I had to simplify. A lot of it is from the 1800s, the 1600, and I had to do a lot of research and reading and rereading. And one thing that always touched me is that when I would come to a line where the writer was very specific about continuing the Chaldean name and the heritage, and what they had to suffer, the persecution, the oppression, the genocide that they had to suffer in order to maintain that. So when you see that, it's hard to just look away and try to not honor that heritage or not get involved. I think one of the challenges in the community is really understand for them to understand how important their heritage is, religiously as well as historically as well. You agree with that?
yeah, oh yeah, it's one of the things when you go to seminary is they'll ask you, and it's kind of an interesting, how did you receive the call? And I have used that in a number of different ways. Is, what's my calling today? If it wasn't to get a seminary degree from Berkeley, then what is it? Because I was certainly called to be there at one point. And again, the search for truth is a very big deal. And so with this Eastern perspective that balances with the West, then it feels to me like, truth is attainable. And once I found that, I let go of a lot of academia, a lot of religious history, a lot of things that had human perspectives in them, not the Bible, not the teachings, not the genuine searchers, but I just kind of had to say, okay, if I'm going to search for truth, where does that lie? And kind of put my own human opinions aside.
So with this last question, Roy, what can supporters do to help further your mission and our mission, I guess, to preserve the Chaldean legacy? What advice would you give Chaldeans? And also, by the way, non-Chaldeans, because this applies to everybody. This is the cradle of civilization, and this history really applies to everybody. It's not reserved for the Chaldeans.
Well, I'm gonna, take off my flag here and just, is with the books that we have, and this is a very simple book on the children's book to learn Aramaic, and of course, this book is the book that describes the culture that the language came out of, and this is the book that I'll talk about on November 8th, on Saturday. And these are open to the general public. And so as you learn from different areas, and I'm very suspect of television and the internet to learn from, because I have familiarity with both, and they're more or less venues of entertainment. And I'm really in a venue of education. And to get the genuine story, you need multiple sources. And I would just consider those, whether they're Chaldean or from within other communities, to consider educating themselves in a number of different ways. But until you can educate yourself and understand what the issues are, I would be very careful about speaking publicly or even in some sort of forum on them, unless you're there to learn.
Yes, that's a very good point, because a lot of people who have just read bits and pieces and try to piece something together, but it does take a lot of in-depth reading and education, but it's not boring. Let's just say that. It's not one of those where you're forced. For me, as soon as I started finding information that was linked together, I became so passionate. Like for me, reading is a treat about this topic, because it's very, and you're kind of connecting the dots and trying to piece together your heritage. How wonderful is that? It's a beautiful history, and I encourage everybody. This event is going to be live on Saturday, November 8th. It starts at 10 a.m. We have Jacob Bakal. We have a lot of speakers. We have Roy that are going to be joining us.
And wrote his book with Bishop Sorrow. That's
yes,
a big deal.
It's the new book about the Chaldean churches, the Chaldean Catholic churches in the U.S.
And
so
one
we
of
have
the representatives, Canada as well. He mentions he has his history of the Chaldean Catholic Church. That goes from early to modern. But when Chaldeans came to North America, they didn't come to the United States first. They went to Canada. And that's where the forum is. So we brought in a Canadian priest, Father John, to speak on the subject. First church there in Calgary, in Ottawa province. And so these are things that it's not only are they coming from a land of first, but they're sharing first in a way that they're still doing that. The Chaldean community.
Yes. So join us. All people have to do is just grab their coffee or tea and just sit behind a tablet or something, and then we'll be speaking. Thank you so much for your time, Roy, and thank you for all that you do for the Chaldean community.
Shana, of course. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.